Ebrahim Deen, a researcher at think tank Afro Middle-East Centre, joins us via Skype for the latest. Ebrahim, good evening and thank you for joining us on The Globe.
Thanks for having me, and compliments of the season.
Compliments to you too, Ebrahim. Now, let's start off with just watching those scenes of the people of Iran out in Tehran, filling out the streets, and the leader Ayatollah Khamenei literally in tears. Those type of scenes, these are the scenes that the world is watching, and there's also calls for Saudi Arabia, from Saudi Arabia, with calls for a de-escalation of tensions, calls for calm, and other international leaders and officials. What's your take on the scenes, vow of revenge from citizens, and especially that message from Soleimani's daughter?
Yes, I mean, I think there's two things. One is the sheer number of protests show how popular he was. There's hundreds and thousands, if not millions, of protests. I do, however, think two things. One is the fact that, yes, Iran will retaliate. And, there has been efforts at de-escalation, but, Iran doesn't want to see a war and won't attack or act retaliatory attack in such a way that will lead to a much greater escalation. So it will have to retaliate, but in a certain way. But in saying so, the Saudi calls for calm is in light of many other regional calls, and also is actually a critique of the Trump administration more than it's a critique of the Iranian of Iran. And that's very significant that Saudi Arabia hasn't backed or vehemently sought to back the U.S. administration, but actually has called for calm, mainly because Iran, is currently in process of direct negotiations with the UAE and indirect negotiations with Saudi Arabia to try and de-escalate the regional situation. So, we can see the region seems to be does know of the problems or of the what can happen if tensions escalate, and the region as a whole, including Iran, doesn't want escalation. Iranians, Iran's Khamenei's advice did say they won't. They're not looking for war. They won't attack Saudi interests, and any retaliatory attack will be more on American basis.
Now, Ebrahim, let's go back to the initial move by President Donald Trump of pulling out of the Iranian deal. That should have been was a huge indicator with regards to what might take place going forward.
Yes, I mean, it shows you, one, how irrational in a sense he is, because Iran had been complying. In fact, it had been over-complying according to the IAEA. Two, it also shows you the pressures and the neocons in the U.S. administration that, are willing to risk such things to go on a war or, escapades with Iran. But, in saying so, this targeted strike on Soleimani, many of Trump's, own advisors, especially from within the Pentagon, didn't think he would, undertake or order such a dire or such a, flagrant and bold move. And so, there is much contestation within the administration, but unfortunately, the Trump administration or Trump, really, as many were saying, he first strike and then was watching TV, saw the protests on the Iraqi, the U.S. embassy in Iraq, and then decided to order the strike. His mindset can change just by reading something or looking at something on TV.
Looking at reaction from the U.S. internally, where the Democrats have come out and sort of pointed out to the fact that there wasn't much, or there isn't much evidence to show exactly why the attack had taken place, and the fact that President Trump had not consulted with them as part of his government. What does this mean in terms of why do you think that President Trump would make such a bold move, and on the one hand have the Democrats speaking against it, and the timing of the attack, looking at the internal elections that the US will be going through, and then reaction from NATO saying that they support President Donald Trump's actions?
Two things. One is, in terms of the U.S. politics, most Democrats have come out against it for two reasons. One is it's partisanship within Congress, but also many Democrats do want to avoid any war with Iran. They do see the consequences. It was under Barack Obama that the nuclear deal was signed. Two, though, the timing I think is interesting because, we just see today that John Bolton said that he is willing to testify on the Senate in terms of impeachment if subpoenaed. So Trump's move was also aimed at the distraction, to try and distract from the internal situation within the U.S. The impeachment hearings, issues over Ukraine, especially since the evidence seems to be stacking up quite a lot. But in terms of the NATO statement, I think it's more just NATO trying to support Trump, mainly because Trump has criticized NATO, so it's NATO falling back in line. But if we look, for example, at the individual statements of, your France, your Germany, all have called for calm, all have called for de-escalation. So it does kind of show that, international sentiment and also international law is against, what happened, targeted strike. The UN Special Rapporteur for extrajudicial killings issued a long Twitter statement on Friday, basically showing, detailing how it actually contravenes international law and even domestic US law to a certain extent.
Now, the meeting that is expected to take place by EU foreign ministers, it's an emergency meeting to hold talks on the situation between the US and Iran. What do you think is going to come out of that meeting? And do you think that President Donald Trump will listen to any reason?
I think two things. One is the EU from 2017, 2018 has always issued statements against the Trump administration, especially in relation to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. So the EU meeting that's going to happen will discuss two things. One is the US-Iran, but also Iran, moving away from its commitments under the JCPOA, that was stated on Saturday. The meeting will call for calm. It will call for Iran to re-enter or recommit itself to the JCPOA. But unfortunately, Trump is not going to listen to what the EU says, and the Iranians, they're not seeing much benefit from the JCPOA. So they have said that we're moving away from the JCPOA just as a threat more than as a strategic long-term move that they're willing to commit as soon as the economic benefits are starting to be seen or can start being seen.
President Trump has stated on social media, on Twitter, the fact that just stating the amount of trillions of US dollars that have been spent on military, purchases, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, Iran has vowed to, make sure that revenge is instituted against the US and against President Donald Trump's property, so to speak, or assets. How do you think this is going to play out? Do you think that Iran will look at going toe-to-toe with the US? Can they even be able to manage to do that? Firstly, looking at the fact that the US is one of the biggest world powers.
Yeah, the latter part of your question, I think, is the answer, is that they won't be able to go toe-to-toe. Iran is very rational, very calculating, and doesn't want to go. Aside from the economic consequences, the regional consequences will be dire. Iran will most likely attack American interests, but, in saying so, more likely American interests in Iraq, because it can, the capacity is greater there, but it also allows for some plausible deniability, as Iran would want to seek. So Iran doesn't want a war. The Trump administration also doesn't want a war. It's an election year. Trump supposedly is this isolationist president. Yes, he wants to act tough, but also doesn't want a war. So, it's, at the moment, Iran will respond asymmetrically. It then depends on how Trump feels, not rather than what Trump does, but how Trump feels, about that response. Because, any escalation from the American side again could then cause further escalation and more tension. So currently, as it stands, it doesn't look like there will be, direct confrontation between the US and Iran, but there will most definitely be, a retaliation for the killing of Qasem Soleimani and Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis.
And very quickly, Ebrahim, just considering the fact that, do you think that Iraq will only be the only country country where these targets can, or, possible attacks could take place, bearing in mind that the U.S. has assets all over the world?
I mean, I think, Iraq is the biggest theater operation that this can happen in. There's also Syria, to an extent, the US, the Iranians do have proxy groups in Lebanon, but it's more likely that it will happen in Iraq or Syria because, Iran doesn't want to escalate tensions too much. It won't want to, directly attack, for example, a US ally like the UAE or the Saudis, because there has been mediation efforts or ongoing mediation efforts. He doesn't want to scupper that as well. So it's most likely that it will be carried out in a place where the US is actively in combat in. And I mean, the two biggest places that is Iraq and, and Syria, which seem to be most likely. And also, the Iranians have, in a sense, flexed their muscle where we saw the Iraqi, the pro-Iranian factions, or at least some of the pro-Iranian factions in Iraq, in the Iraqi parliament, issue a call or issue a statement endorsing, the pulling out of American troops from Iraq. So, the Trump's move has been already counterproductive and, in the coming days may just get worse.
Ebrahim, thank you so much for joining us this evening. That's where we'll leave it for now. That is Ebrahim Deen, a researcher at think tank Afro Middle-East Centre, joining us via Skype.